Hello, I'm with Professor Tom O'Loughlin today, and I'm asking him the question, why study the lectionary? So Tom, first of all, what is a lectionary?
In Christian worship, or indeed in Jewish worship, because we read scriptures, one needs a plan that organises the reading over a period of time. And a lectionary takes the various books that make up the scriptures, the Bible, and breaks them down into pieces that are the right size to be read at a particular service on a particular day. So a lectionary is a plan for reading.
But isn't that a bit of a limitation for people who are organising worship? I mean, surely there must be a case for letting people choose the readings that they want to read that will fit with a particular theme of the service.
Well, it's one thing to have the theme of the service if you take it something like Christmas, Easter. Obviously, at Christmas and Easter, you expect to hear those parts of the story, whether from the prophets or from the Gospels or Paul, that fit with those particular feasts. And then you move to something like the Mother's Day or a wedding or a funeral, and you will pick readings that are appropriate to those subjects. But there's a danger that you can end up with sort of like the theme of our liturgy today is, which is a bit like the theme of our assembly today is. So the theme of our assembly today is flowers, and you would go and you'd probably pick a piece out of the Song of Songs, or you would pick the reference to the lilies of the field from the Gospel. The problem is that liturgy is not about themes apart from the liturgical year and apart from great events in individual lives. Liturgy is about the praise of God, and in the praise of God, for Jews and Christians, memory is establishing who you are, why you're there, why it is a good thing to praise and thank and worship God. And the way that is done is by saying, well, if you leave it up to individuals, or if you leave it up to how I feel about it, you'll always pick the same bits again and again and again. So there's umpteen arguments down the centuries, we must have freedom to choose. But the freedom to choose ends up with a handful, a canon within a canon, a little select group of texts that happen to suit you or happen to suit your particular view on life, on liturgy, on faith. So the way to overcome the dangers of just getting the bits that I always like and avoiding the bits that might be terribly important to someone else but I don't like to preach on is to have a formula that lays out the readings. And already at the time of Jesus, there was actually a formal way of reading the Torah, reading the 5 books of Moses in the synagogue, precisely so that there would be a plan that you'd get the good bits with the bad bits, the important bits with the seemingly unimportant bits, the bits that made a lot of sense to you with the bits that are obscure to you. And they may be the bits that you should hear most. So Christians took that over, and Christians have, in all the churches of the East and in many of the churches of the West, they have said, this is too important a thing to be left just to how I feel about it on a particular morning, or to the hunch or the flavour of an individual. Yeah. And it's something that must be laid out for one.
So the lectionary allows all of the scripture, or almost all of the scripture, to be read on a regular cycle. And you're saying that it's something that was known to the Christian church from the very beginning. How about more recent changes with the lectionary?
The most interesting thing about lectionaries at the moment is that never in the history of the Christian Church has so much thought been given to lectionaries than in the last 50 or 60 years. For instance, the Western Church ended up with a lectionary by the 5th century, and it remained virtually unchanged, with vast numbers of blunders and mistakes, to become the lectionary of the Roman Missal of 1570 and, say, the Book of Common Prayer. So anyone who uses today the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, they're actually preserving mistakes in the lectionary that can be dated back to particular manuscripts in the late Middle Ages, and the same would be true of its virtual parallel, which is the Old Roman lectionary. The problem with that was that the scriptural books, and let's take the key scriptural books for Christians are the 4 Gospels, were not designed to be read silently, but were designed to be heard. And each book was written with a particular agenda. So the perspective of Mark is different to the perspective of Matthew, is different to that of Luke and of John. And so people said, is there any way that we could build a lectionary that would allow not just a bit of this gospel and a bit of something else and then a bit of something else, but to find a way of letting each of the gospels be heard in a systematic way. And it was actually the Calvinist church in France in the 1950s who said, well, one way to do it would be to say, let's take the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke, and let's read them, give a year to each of them, and let's keep John and read him at Christmas and Easter. And then Mark, there wouldn't be enough of Mark to read over 30 Sundays outside Christmas and Easter. So what we'll do is there's an interesting little bit where John dates his gospel, the internal mythical date is related to the Gospel of Mark. So someone said, well, okay, let's take part of John and read it to fill out Mark. It seems such a good idea that actually when the Catholic Church was then reviving its liturgy in the 1960s and realised that one of the major areas where it had to do a complete revision was the lectionary, it actually took over this idea from France, and they developed it more, and a little bit of lectionaries need a lot of experimentation. So it had been experimented with in France in the late 50s and early 60s. Then more experimentation led to a lectionary that was produced for the Roman Catholic Church in 1970, which interestingly didn't cause a fanfare in Catholicism. But when other churches, some of whom had never actually used lectionaries, saw this, they said, this is a really remarkable achievement. So the gospel sequence became the basis after a further 5 years of experimentation in the United States as the revised common lectionary. And then when the Anglican Church was reviewing its worship, it experimented with a lectionary, a 2-year cycle in the Alternative Service book, which some people may remember emerged during the 1980s, and that was found to be a failure as a lectionary. They then took over the revised common lectionary. So curiously, people are aware of all the divisions between the churches. But the lectionary is one of the areas where the churches have learned from one another. And so for the first time probably the first time in Christian history, we have a very well-planned lectionary that is ideally suited to the nature of the central texts used in Christian worship, the four Gospels, and we've actually achieved a way of doing it that is being used by Catholics, Protestants, Anglicans, and every year new groups are saying lectionaries are a good idea, and this particular format is probably as good a system as you can get.
So it's a major form of union, in fact, between large numbers of denominations. Now, Tom, you've written a book on this, which has recently just been published. Thomas O'Loughlin, Making the Most of the Lectionary, a User's Guide. And I can recommend this to all our viewers. It's a very interesting book written by someone who, as I think we've already seen, is very committed to the idea of the lectionary. Tom, thank you very much.
Francis, thank you.